Hey guys, it's Kevin in my review for Pieces of Her. So what this show is basically about is we center on the character of Andy. She has been separated from her mom for a bit now. She is coming back from the police force. She is graduated from, I believe, police academy. Basically, she is now returning to see her mom. They are meeting up for lunch, and this attack happens, and her mom is able to stealthily take this guy down with pretty much no kind of struggle whatsoever. And after this really gets her daughter to question what is really going on and starts to open a web of dark secrets that her mom has been keeping. And I was very much looking forward to this show. I didn't really know too much about it going in, but I knew Toni Collette was in it, and that was enough to get my excitement. You guys know that I think that she is probably one of the best actresses working today, always delivers, and, you know, haven't really seen her on, like, a show like this before, so I was very excited to see how this would turn out. You know, Netflix didn't really promote it all that much, but I was really holding out hope for it, and it very much disappointed me. Look, Pieces of Her is not at all a terrible show, but this is a elongated and frequently messy show that really could have been so much better had it just been condensed to bits, and really just suffers from a lot of issues that I feel a lot of limited series tend to have. But we're just getting into right now, starting off with the cast. And I will say right now, that is easily the best element of this entire show. I think really the entire cast, everyone does do a really strong job here, but of course we gotta talk about Toni Collette, who, look, she's just one of the best actresses working today, and she does a really good job, I think, playing this role of Laura. She's constantly keeping you guessing. There's so many elements to her character that you're just so kind of like just as in the dark about when it comes to Andy, just like Andy is, and I thought overall Collette just did a really good job. She added so many layers to this character and really just kind of kept my interest throughout, and I thought that she definitely did do a really good job here. And Bella Heathcote is really good here too. Andy is a very reactionary role. She's a character that is constantly finding out more information as the show goes on, and I thought that she definitely did do a really good job and provided the, you know, right amount of sort of emotion that was that needed to be there for that character, similar to how Collette provided the necessary intrigue. I think the back and forth between these two, they work very well together. I thought they had a really good sort of dynamic to them. The rest of the cast also does do a pretty good job here. Omari Hardwick is pretty good as Laura's ex-husband. I thought for what he had, he did pretty well. Jessica Barden was a pretty big standout to me. She actually plays the younger Laura who we see in flashbacks, and I thought that she definitely did do a really good job. I've always been a fan of her, and she definitely does give a pretty strong performance in the show. Like I said, there's a lot of issues with the show, but the performances really are not one of them. Okay, now let's get to the directing and the writing, because this is really where we get to my issues when it comes to this show. Look, at first, I will say the directing was not really a big issue for me. I thought the show did a pretty good job of, you know, building that intrigue and you know, leaving us in suspense. There's a really nice cliffhanger they leave episode 1 on. We're not really sure, you know, where the show's going to go. The problem is maintaining that suspense. The show has a really big problem with doing that, because after about the third or fourth episode, all of that suspense kind of just like fades away, because you're just very anxious to get to the bottom of what's really going on here. And I just don't think the directing was particularly strong to the show. To be honest with you, I didn't really feel like there was much of a style here. I felt like beyond just like the flashiness and, you know, building tension, there just wasn't a lot that I felt like Charlotte Stoudt really brought to the table here. And that's unfortunate, because I do think this is a show that could have had a really interesting sort of vision behind it, but it just felt like it was lacking some kind of voice. It just kind of feels like they wanted to do an adaptation of the show, and they brought somebody on, and she just didn't really have much of a vision here. She kind of just, like, you know, went through the motions, and I just wasn't a big fan of the way that she helmed the show. But easily the biggest issue with the show comes from the writing, and it pains me to say that, because again, I think the show starts off, and I was fairly intrigued. The show actually did hook me in pretty early on. I like the setup here where, you know, we have Laura, and she's in this, you know, there's this attack in this diner. She's able to get out of it pretty easily, and from there we realize there are all of these secrets that she's keeping from Andy. That's a pretty good setup, and I thought they did a good job in, at first, really building that intrigue. You want to find out more about what's going on with Laura. Why is has she kept this from Andy for so long? You know, what's really gone on in her past? How has she, you know, changed since then? You know, certain things that she did throughout Andy's childhood, it has a different impact on her now. But the problem is, again, similar to the directing, after about the third or fourth episode, it just doesn't really become much more than what it really is. And that's really my biggest issue with the show. There really is no reason for the show to go on for more than like 4 episodes, but for some reason it does. And I just felt like after a certain point, they really just were kind of dragging things out. And it always feels like, because of the fact that they are focusing so much on Laura's past, half of this show is flashbacks of what Laura was involved in, this like cult that she, you know, ended up coming across and things like that. You know, you constantly are thinking there's going to be some bigger element, something bigger that connects all of this. Another, you know, jaw-dropping cliffhanger that's going to, you know, jaw-dropping twist that's going to change everything. And I can just tell you right now, nothing of the sort ever happens. The show stays very simplistic throughout. It really is just, you know, we see she has some elements of her past. They're coming back to get her, and they now have to do what they can to deal with that conflict and also protect Andy. Like, there isn't really that much going on within this show in terms of a mystery. After a while, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going on here, and so I just checked out of it pretty quickly, unfortunately, and I just didn't really feel like the writing was that great because they weren't able to maintain that suspense. They weren't able to maintain that intrigue, and because of that, my interest very much did wane. The other big issue with the show that I really do have is its focus. You would think because of the show focusing a lot on Laura and her past, that she'd be the main character, that a lot of this show would revolve around her and her, you know, and kind of like seeing why she's kept all these secrets from Andy, but she's not the main character. As I already mentioned, Andy is very much the focus of the show. And this was a really big mistake because Andy as a character, look, like I said, Bella Heathcote is really good in this role. She's really trying here. But Andy as a character is not good, to put it lightly. Andy is not a good character in the slightest. And the biggest reason for that are 2 things. One, she really doesn't evolve that much from the beginning of the show to the end. There's no real arc to latch onto. There's nothing that really changes within her from learning these revelations. She very much just functions as like the audience here, where she's kind of just like figuring things out. There are moments in the show where it's literally just her like watching the same video for like an entire episode. She's also easily one of the dumbest main characters that I have seen in a long time. There are so many moments in this show where it is clear that Andy should not be doing the things that she's doing, but she is constantly putting herself in harm's way and almost willingly doing so. Like, there are ways for her to easily get out of this situation, and yet she continually is putting herself out there. It's like she wants to be hurt. It's like she wants to get hurt. It's like she wants something life-changing to happen to her, and the show never really explains why she decides to do this. Why does she take all of these risks? Why does she constantly put herself in harm's way? The show never really explains that, and I just found that to be such a frustrating element of her character, because when in the midst of her making all of these stupid decisions, there is a compelling show in there somewhere. I like the idea of Andy, you know, finding out things about Laura gradually, but the show also makes a very poor decision to keep these 2 apart throughout the majority of the show. So because of that, we don't really get to see a lot about how this affects their relationship. It actually takes till episode 6 to see these 2 reunite again. She goes off on her own pretty much at the end of episode 1, and throughout the majority of the show, these 2 are kind of kept apart. Andy's running into all these random people who have information on Laura. They don't really serve that much of a purpose in the story other than to spout exposition, and again, I didn't find it terribly compelling. I wish I could say that this was something that kept my interest, but it just really didn't, and that's what really brought this show down for me, is that I just found what was going on here to not be particularly interesting. And the flashbacks themselves, let's talk about them. I honestly found to be, and I get why they're here at first, because they want to give us those answers as to what's going on here. But I gotta be honest with you, the majority of these flashbacks, I honestly found to be kind of superfluous. I felt like they were just kind of here so they had a reason to drag the show out, because at the end of the day, when you really think about this show and how everything wraps up, the majority of these flashbacks don't really serve all that much of a purpose. They give us some context into Laura's previous actions, but we didn't really need that context. I feel like it was stuff that was pretty easy to infer, and without the flashbacks, I don't think the show would be all that different. And if they were going to do the flashbacks, I think they should not have done it throughout the season. I think this was a mistake. If they had taken one episode, focus on the flashbacks, hell, maybe do like a 2-part episode, I think that would have been much better than what they ultimately end up doing, because at a certain point when they have these flashbacks and we're seeing a younger version of Andy, I had a very hard time following what the hell was going on. Episode 7 especially is such a clusterfuck. I could not tell you what was going on throughout the majority of that episode and what was happening in the present day, what was a flashback. It was just very hard to tell, and I felt like they took what's a very simple story and overcomplicated it. And they didn't overcomplicate in the sense where they added extra layers or something fresh to it. No, they tried to drag it out unnecessarily, and so it made a story that really is not that hard to understand and really does not have that much going on. They made it generally confusing, and that's what made the show so incredibly frustrating for me. I wanted to latch onto these characters. I wanted to latch onto this story, but the more this went on, the more it just continued to lose me. And the way the show ended especially, none of that time is justified. None of what we end up getting is worth it. It is such a lame finale that ends in a way where it felt like we ended the conflict like 20 minutes into the last episode, and then we had like 30 minutes left just processing what went down. And that's a lot of what's the problem is with the show. I just don't think, again, the writing is just very strong here at all, and I think they had a really big issue with finding a way to maintain that suspense throughout the majority of the show. The first 3 episodes, they do a pretty good job with it, but they really are not able to preserve that suspense throughout the majority of the show. Now, I will say, the scenes where Laura and Andy are together are actually pretty good. There's a scene in episode 6, especially, that is probably my favorite scene in the entire show. It was generally very impactful, the way everything went down. But because of the fact we don't see these two together, it just doesn't feel all that satisfying. A lot of it feels very random, very much just like it happened so we can create some conflict, and I just don't think they handled a lot of that very well. I think that the majority to keep these two apart also was not a very smart decision, and I think it very much did hurt the story rather than help the story in the long run. I don't have much to say in terms of cinematography. I think the show is very basic. It honestly at points look like it could be on just like a basic cable network. Hell, the show begins, and this is a Netflix show, mind you. Every episode begins with a previously on, and that makes me think that maybe this wasn't supposed to be a Netflix show. Maybe this show was supposed to be on like a basic cable network. At points it feels like something that would be on like fucking Freeform or something. So maybe that's the home that it was supposed to be, but for some reason it got shopped to Netflix. I don't really know how that happened, but it very much does have the vibe of that at some point. So I just think, again, cinematography-wise, not really much to say. Score, there isn't really much to say either. And the editing, I already touched upon this. I just think the show goes on way too long. There really is no reason for the show to be 8 episodes. I think 4 or 5 probably was enough for this show. I don't think they needed more than that in order to really tell this story. And I also think the pacing at points is just... This story moves at a snail's pace, and the main reason for it is because the first few episodes are very fast-paced in terms of everything that happens, and after a certain point, they don't really know how else to move along with this story, so they just, like, drag things out that don't need to be, and it leads to just a lot of random directions for the show, and I just think the pacing here, they needed to tighten it up a lot more. They had to lessen some episodes. I think the show would have been far more impactful if they had done that, but unfortunately, again, that was not the case. There's also a lot of directions the show goes, and particularly with Andy's character, that just did not feel earned in the slightest. Just the direction that ended up going just did not feel earned in the slightest, and I think, again, a big issue with it is just because of all of these flashbacks, because of the fact that they are trying to do so much, there are just all these things that happen, and they just don't feel natural, they don't feel well explored. Laura's relationship with her husband is so cut and dry. It doesn't really feel like it was given the proper time to really, like, dive into it, because he's also learning a lot of this, like, as she, you know, as Andy is, and again, they don't devote the proper time to what's going on. Ultimately, Pieces of Her is just a huge misfire, in my opinion. There's some good performances here, there's some good ideas, and there's intrigue in the beginning for sure, but after a while, the show just doesn't really know how to keep things interesting, and it really does kind of fizzle out. Not to mention, our main character makes some of the most inane decisions that I have seen in a show in a very long time. There are some ideas that I really do like, but between that and the endless exposition and the, you know, the show being riddled with flashbacks that it really doesn't need to be here at all, and an ending that just left me so unsatisfied, Pieces of Her is a show that I really just found myself so frustrated by. I wanted so much more from it. I think if they had a director that had a bit more of a style here, I think if they were able to latch on, I think if they were able to add some layers to some of these characters, and if they were able to find a way to keep things a little bit more interesting, add anything else to the show rather than the very simplistic plot they decided to go with, I think this really could have been something special. But at the end of the day, this just feels like another throwaway limited series that I don't really think anyone is going to be talking about. Hell, no one's really talked about the show at all, and it honestly is very easy to see why. I was very much let down by this show, and I am going to give it a C. And look, maybe it's because, like, I've been watching a lot more TV this year, but this was just a show that just really was not able to hold my interest, and I very quickly just kind of, like, fell off entirely. I know Netflix has been having a lot of problems lately. They've really been struggling, and I feel like shows like this are a big reason why. There are some shows you can just say no to distributing. This was very much one of them. They did not need to take on this show, and I think things like this, you know, very much do hurt their brand rather than help it, especially when they invest so much time into things that people just are not watching. But that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have seen Pieces of Her, let me know what you guys thought of it. We'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. So, okay, bye.